as we navigate a world of growing economies, geopolitical tension, world struggling to respond to climate change, how should we think about our energy future? There's so many factors that go into trying to understand how much we need to invest in this generation source, that source of primary energy, and what the strategy of the United States and our allies should be at this challenging time. I'm joined today by Tyler Goodspeed. Tyler, welcome to CSIS.
Good to be here.
Tyler, you are an economic historian, PhD from Cambridge. You formerly served on the Council of Economic Advisors. You are now the chief economist at ExxonMobil, and most importantly, you're a member of the Geoeconomic Council of Advisors here at CSIS.
That's right.
All right, well, I'm really excited to talk to you today. You've recently worked as the lead analyst and author of ExxonMobil's Energy Outlook through 2050. Exxon has a long history of making these scenarios, using them to think about its own investments as well as national strategies. What are the highlights from this year's report?
Yeah, so first of all, I should say I'm part of a team. I'm one part of a team that works on this annual product. And as you said, we've been doing this for decades. Actually, in our office, we have a copy of the 1945 Outlook, where our predecessors were projecting when they thought European refining capacity would come back online, what they thought demand would look like in the coming years. And as you know, considering the very long-term nature of our industry, we need to have a clear idea or an idea of what the world's going to look like in 2030 and 2040, 2050, so that we can allocate capital accordingly. And we make this publicly available in the hope that it might inform policy discussions and public discussions around the energy industry. But it does inform our own planning. And that's different from what other third parties, other companies report, which is very often a scenario. And so it might be aspirational, what we hope the world will look like in 2050, and then we work backwards to determine what would need to happen for that to eventuate. But ours is what you might call a central tendency or best projection.
Dare you call it a forecast?
We'll call it we'll stick to Outlook.
Okay, sounds good. And in this outlook, what are what for this year has really changed? What are you seeing in the numerous trends going on around the world with respect to technology, economic growth, that really stands out to you and the team?
Well, to be honest, one of the things, especially when you look back on history, and 2025 is sort of a nice round number, when you look back on history, one thing that stands out to me and to the team is just how massive the global energy system is, and therefore how, to use an economist term, how trend stationary the global energy stack is. Events have happened over the last 10 years. We've had a lot of technological changes, we've had a lot of policy changes, we've had a lot of economic and geopolitical shocks, and yet if you look at just a graph of the global energy stack, it is remarkably faithful to trend.
And you've brought up a graphic to show. Maybe we can call that up, you can walk us through it, and we can talk about some of the details.
Sure, yeah, so this is that global energy stack going back to 2015. And when you think about everything that's happened since 2015, December 2015, we had the Paris Climate Accord. That prompted a lot of national climate aspirations. You have China Net Zero 2060, you have the European Union's Green New Deal. You also have a lot of changes in the global energy supply mix. So if you think back to before 2010, the U.S. was a net importer of oil and gas. Production was declining. But then in 2016, the U.S. becomes a net exporter of LNG. In 2018, U.S. becomes the world's largest producer of oil and gas, and largest producer of oil specifically. And in fact, now you have the three largest producers of oil in the world are the Russian Federation, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the state of Texas. You also had the formation of OPEC Plus over the past decade. And then you have technological changes. I mean, we had tremendous growth in solar and wind, a lot of penetration of battery electric vehicles. You had geopolitical shocks. You have a pandemic. You have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You have a recession in 2020 followed by supply chain bottlenecks. And yet if you look at that graph of the global energy stack, despite all that going on, that is very smooth, a long trend.
So sometimes what we hear or you read about is the sort of this last couple decades having been a period of energy addition rather than energy transition. And I think this graph is kind of showing us what people who use that argument are saying, in that you have sort of relatively, I would say, slowly growing energy consumption over that period globally. But a lot of the, everything that you were adding, whether that's like solar and wind or increased use of natural gas, you're not seeing globally the same dynamics that we've had in the United States or they're having in Europe, where you're displacing, for instance, coal with natural gas and renewables. Is that kind of roughly what you think?
Well, we have seen a lot of additions to the global energy stack, and the growth rates for solar and wind have been very impressive, and you see that in the headlines. And yet, despite that impressive growth, BEV and solar penetration really only reached 1% of the global energy stack in 2022, and they're now a little bit over 1% for. As of 2024, a little bit over 1% for solar, a little under 3% for BEVs. So I think that just really points to how the scale of the global energy system, the long-lived nature of a lot of these capital investments and the supporting infrastructure, and therefore why this can be slow-moving.
What does this tell us about economics? I mean, or what kind of economic insights can you bring to bear on this question? Because sometimes I think people will look at this problem and they'll say, all right, well, if we just like impose policy, we can move this quickly. Or if we get a fundamental change in the relative cost of renewables compared to fossil fuel, for example, you're going to get a sort of immediate and rapid transition. As an economic thinker, how do you look at this and then think about our energy future?
So I look at this and I'm reminded of a model of economic fluctuations, which Milton Friedman dubbed a plucking model. That basically, we often think of growth as you're growing above potential and then below potential, but the reality is economic growth and fluctuations are typically about an economy that's growing pretty much close to its trend potential, and then you have an adverse shock like a global pandemic, which is about the only thing you can see in this graph.
Right.
And then the economy gradually recovers to its potential and continues to grow at trend. So I think you see that. The other thing that I'm reminded of is the importance of energy and growth and just the inextricable link between those two. So this is, we're looking back to 2015 at our 2015, ExxonMobil's 2015 Global Outlook, because as I said, this is 2025 is this sort of nice round number. We can look back, see how did we do.
Yep.
And actual energy demand came in pretty close to what we projected. Global energy demand came in pretty close to what we projected.
And is that because you got the economic forecast correct, or what underlies that? Hitting the bullseye in that way?
Good question. So when we make the outlook, we take into account economic trends, economic fundamentals. That's probably the most important thing. How many people are there going to be on the planet, and what is going to be their level of activity that they enjoy? But we also take into account technological learning. What are the S curves for different technologies? We also take into account policy, and we also take into account consumer preferences. And so the reason actual energy demand at a global level came in a little bit below our 2015 forecast was because of weaker economic growth in the developing world outside of China. So China and US, EU actually came in a little bit above our forecast, but the rest of the developing world outside of China came in a bit below because economic growth in that part of the world came in lower. And I think that does really underscore that there's no such thing as a high income but energy poor economy.
Right.
Energy prosperity and economic prosperity do go hand in hand.
Okay, I want to talk to you about causality and correlation in that context in a second. But first, let's talk about what should we read across this distribution here?
Yeah, so what's interesting is similar patterns for oil and natural gas that held
Yeah.
for what we saw at the global level and the total energy level. So oil and natural gas demand came in a little bit below our forecast. Again, that was driven by weaker demand growth in the emerging world ex China. The other interesting thing, so again, we were pretty good in the aggregate, but then there's some compositional misses. So the other interesting thing is if we look at some renewables and nuclear, as a whole, it came in pretty close to our 2015 projection. But wind and solar came in above our projection, and nuclear came in below. And I think that was because we didn't fully anticipate in 2015 the reluctance to restart a lot of nuclear capacity after the 2011 Fukushima incident, and we also underestimated the degree of policy support at the national and subnational levels for solar and wind.
Oh, really interesting. Now, okay, so then let's talk a little bit about where this picture goes. I like this. I mean, this is, there's sort of a subtle energy analyst bragging going on here. But of course, we want to think about the future, right? And so when you look through now 2050 in the context of your outlook, what are the big themes that the reader should investigate?
I think one of the big themes is that energy use is going to continue to grow at a slower pace than in the past. And we've seen this trend for decades of the energy required to produce a widget has been declining over time per unit.
Yep.
And that's in line with productivity improvements. So when we're looking out to 2050, we see a world that is using about 15% more energy. But again, there are some big compositional differences in that there's declining energy intensity in the developed world and increasing energy use in the developing world. So about 25% greater in the developing world, about 10% less in the developed world.
And in that, let's talk about the developing world in your outlook a little bit, because it seems like both here in the United States and internationally, the conversation has moved pretty abruptly at the policy level from one focused on global greenhouse gas emissions, what you would call climate finance, which was really sort of financing low carbon energy as part of the economic development strategy for emerging markets, to now, it seems like there's some steps back from climate ambition. Secretary Wright is very focused on energy prosperity, this idea that if we sort of unleash energy resources, that's a primary component of economic growth in the developing world. So in your outlook, what do you see? What is the energy story for the 4 billion people who are going to rise toward the middle class over the next 30 years?
Well, I think it is important to bear in mind that in the world today, there are about 2 billion people who rely on harmful cooking fuels. There are 750 million people who lack access to reliable electricity. So part of economic development is improving energy access.
Sort of like baseline energy security.
Baseline energy security. Right. In OECD economies, the average person consumes about 160 million BTUs per person per day. And so that can get us where we need to go for work, that heats and cools our homes, that powers electronic devices. And there's a concept that is in the public discourse of a modern energy minimum, and that's about 50 million BTUs per person per day. So a lot of the world is not even at that modern energy minimum.
Right. And so in your outlook, so here's my picture, right? I want you to challenge this if you can. I see desperately poor people, right? Fuels are a really convenient thing to use. You don't have to make big infrastructure investments, right? You don't have to buy a solar panel and a battery, illustratively speaking, right? You can run, you can kind of pay for your energy services over time, right? And this seems like for the financial situation of a desperately poor person is very, very handy. I then see the case of Pakistan over the last couple of years, where utility service has been terrible, and we've seen mega deployment of home brewed and small business deployed off-grid or loosely grid-attached solar and battery systems to just provide basic energy services in a place where like utility service just can't work appropriately. So I guess my question is really like, what is the picture for you and within the outlook for what this sort of energy growth looks like? Now we've got more diverse technology options, and the portfolios of the poor are just very different from the ones of you and I here in the developed world. How should we really think about that development challenge in terms of all of these energy resources?
Yeah, so I think this is one reason why we see a lot of growth in solar and wind, because they have come down those cost curves very, very steeply.
Yeah.
And so that's why we see solar and wind going from about 3% of the global energy mix to about 11, 12%. Also, natural gas is a very flexible fuel. It's relatively low cost, it's relatively lower emission, and so we do see natural gas demand increasing both in industrial demand and also in power generation, and a lot of the growth in both solar and wind and natural gas is at the expense of coal.
Right. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the regionality of that story, right? So my sense reading the report, LNG demand, you have a fairly bullish outlook on LNG demand through 2050. A lot of that's going to be in Southeast Asia, right? The sort of emerging Asian economies. Tell us a little bit more about what you see going on there, and the U.S. as a big exporter of LNG. How should our leadership be thinking about opportunities in that space?
Well, so to give a sense of the scale, we have global natural gas demand increasing by about 80 billion cubic feet per day. That to about 500 billion cubic feet. 80 billion cubic feet is about what the commercial and residential sectors consume today. So that is big growth. And as I said, what's driving that growth is you have a flexible fuel, you have a relatively low cost fuel, and you have a relatively low emission fuel. And also, to illustrate that, what I mean by flexible, one of the insights in this outlook was about the effect of increasing solar and wind penetration on coal emissions. Because a puzzle for us in prior iterations of the Global Outlook was why, despite the fact that we saw greater solar and wind penetration and nuclear penetration in China, they were also burning more coal. And it turns out that as you get solar and wind displacement of coal, and coal capacity is running at lower capacity utilization, sort of 60% versus 90%, it's not as efficient. Right. Especially then when your coal capacity has to fire up to 90% utilization because of the intermittency of variable renewable energy. Coal power plants just aren't designed to be doing that sort of fluctuation. So there's a lot of efficiency loss. So we found that actually China coal plants are having to burn more coal to generate the same number of electrons.
Right.
Whereas with natural gas, you can run at lower capacity utilization, you can fire up, you can fire down without the same loss of efficiency that you see in coal.
We did an interview with an expert on the Chinese power sector maybe now about a year and a half ago, and he said that one of the things that explains the sort of expansion of the Chinese coal fleet that's happening right now is that problem, right? These older coal plants are very poor at ramping up and down. And so a lot of the newer generation, I don't know if it's akin to gas, but is designed to be more flexible, exactly, I think, because of the dynamics you're talking about. So like, as we see that capacity expansion, I think US policymakers see that and they get discouraged about China's climate goals, or they don't quite understand what's going on here. And it does actually seem like it's a systems efficiency move, responding exactly to that. China having not the same gas resources that we have here in the US. LNG, it is this incredibly important, geopolitical thing, for lack of a better term. It's been an important part of the U.S.'s sort of now emergence as an energy exporter. One of the things I learned amidst the European energy crisis is that export capacity is big, expensive, and takes a lot to finance. import capacity is much more labile, right? Oftentimes you can regas on a floating platform. We can move those things around. Do you have anything? What is your picture of the sort of the shape of the LNG market in 10, 20 years time as you see that growing demand? Like, do you kind of see centers of demand? Do you see demand potentially moving around? Kind of how do you think about regional composition in that context? I mean, the U.S., Qatar, and others are going to be big exporters. We know where the export terminals are going to be. I don't know if we have a strong picture of where the importing is going to happen.
So as I said, we do anticipate that the biggest source of growth for natural gas demand writ large is in the developing world outside of China. And certainly when you think about where you can have agglomeration effects, it's likely to be in places that are proximate to production of the fuel, that have existing pipeline infrastructure, and that have existing and potentially scalable export facilities. Because as you said, it's a lot more technically and economically challenging to freeze gas than to unfreeze it.
The physics of it actually make a lot of sense, right? Yeah. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about climate and your outlook on climate before going back to some of the deeper economic questions here. The report sees a 25% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2050. Clearly outside the target set by the Paris Climate Agreement and sort of stated government ambition. But actually pretty decent progress against what has been a very hard thing to change. What drives that, and what signposts should we look for the world doing better on greenhouse gas emissions?
So it is an achievement for the world to have a near doubling of GDP and to add 2 billion more people and to lower greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that is pretty unprecedented. But as you say, more work is needed to achieve the objective, the goal of keeping warming to below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. The drivers of reductions in emissions in our outlook are in particular the displacement of coal by natural gas and also by solar and wind, with, as I noted, that solar and wind share going from about 3% to about 11, 12%. In terms of signposts, what we do, because again, this is informing our investments, our capital allocation, what we do is we track announced projects, we track permits, what has been permitted, and we track construction. So for things like nuclear reactors, for solar and wind deployment, for battery electric vehicle penetration, for announced CCS projects. And here again, there's that interesting, in the aggregate, how have we done? Compositionally, how have we done? So for battery electric vehicle penetration, in the aggregate, we've done pretty well. But that has been driven by underestimating growth in China and slightly overestimating penetration in the US and Europe.
Interesting. And that particular case seems like there's going to be very little spillover, at least in the immediate term. I don't see a lot of Chinese EVs coming into the United States over the next few years. And we almost feel like at a point of almost technical divergence when it comes to that particular technology.
So I think this does illustrate one of the challenges that we have moving forward on the emissions front, which is when we talk about hard to decarbonize sectors, what do we mean? So for vehicles, we've made a lot of progress, and we anticipate more progress in terms of passenger vehicles and sort of light duty last mile trucking. But we don't yet have the alternatives, don't yet have the energy density for long haul trucking, for maritime, for aviation. And then for industrial processes, when we talk about hard to decarbonize, what we're really talking about is either emissions from processes, for example, the production of ammonia, or we're talking about hard to electrify because of the heat required. So your steel, your cement, your glass, your aluminum, these require a lot of heat. You're talking 750 degrees to as high as 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. And electric arc furnaces, those can do recycling steel, but in terms of producing steel from raw form, it's hard to generate that heat.
I've always been puzzled by this, Tyler, because like when we think about the economic development challenge over the next 30 years, a lot of that challenge is going to be construction in the developing world. Concrete, steel, glass, all the sort of hard to abate or must abate goods. And if you think about the sort of the total emissions pulse that comes with that, it seems like we may have under indexed on being able to make those industrial goods a little bit more cleaner, or a little cleaner, or be developing them such that we can be at near zero emissions toward the end of that of the next few decades. That there's like, it seems like that's been an underappreciated factor as people often just think about sort of primary energy consumption at the consumer level.
So when we project the developing world going from about 40% of global output to today to about 50% of global output by 2050, or a little over 50% by 2050, that means a larger capital stock in the developing world. And that requires infrastructure investment. That requires construction. That means a lot more plastic.
Yep.
And so that's why actually the biggest driver of oil demand in our outlook is oil as feedstock.
Right.
Because you think about what goes into residential and commercial real estate construction. And on the industrial front, this is one of the reasons that we are making investments in carbon capture and sequestration, is because when you think about the technical and economic challenges to generating the heat required for glass, for aluminum, for petrochemicals, for steel and concrete, the technical and economic challenges of alternatives makes it difficult. So that's why one solution is you rely on CCS, on natural gas in combination with CCS, so that you can capture those emissions at source.
Interesting. I mean, this is, we've spent a lot of time here in our work looking at the sort of carbon intensity of production. I've been trying to argue in various papers and other things. We should actually think about this as much as a part of our climate strategy as a part of our economic strategy over the next 30 years. Because it seems to me the more you can produce at lower carbon intensity in a world of carbon border adjustments and continued, though slower than we would like, progress toward emissions goals, like being able to provide low emissions goods, I think is part of competitiveness in the future. I know you guys have done a lot of work on the sort of the measurement challenges there and the enabling technologies, but I beg to see more in 2026 to think about that as an element of our sort of energy strategy going forward. Okay, are you game for a lightning round?
Okay.
You started with we talked about stationarity. We talked about this very kind of what I think about as the high inertia of the energy system. We've also got some pretty significant changes happening in global economics right now. So I'm interested in your thoughts on AI. I'm interested in your thoughts on population, right? Is the nature of economic growth going to change in a way that would disrupt the stationarity we've seen so far?
So if you look at most third-party estimates, credible third-party estimates of the growth in AI and data center demand, you're looking at a factor of 2 to 6 by 2030, but it's from a relatively low base, sort of 1 to 2% globally, and then times that by 2 to 6. The technical optimist in me looks at the tremendous improvements, tremendous efficiency gains in GPU processing power. I mean, we're talking factors of 45,000. Often early on, companies are keen to just demonstrate proof of concept, so their energy efficiency and just broader resource intensity of production declines over time. On the other hand, we do often see time and time again examples of Jevons paradox, that as efficiency improves, you actually demand more. But the constraint is ultimately going to be how much are people, end users, going to be willing to pay for the services provided by AI and data centers. And so that's why I was a little bit puzzled hearing the CEO of Microsoft talk about tech companies requiring society's permission. I would think more there's a price.
Right, yeah.
That's usually what rations. And then you asked about population. I'm not sure that we have totally internalized what below replacement rate total fertility rates mean. So total fertility rate in China could be as low as 0.7. I mean, that means that an initial population of 100 is within 2 generations below 25.
Sure. I mean, that's approaching the window over which you're making these forecasts, right?
Yes. So how do those two factors balance? On one hand, you have increasing energy consumption by AI that maybe to a certain extent is a substitute for cognitive human labor. On the other hand, you have peaking and then declining populations. How do those two play out? Well, people consume energy too. So on net, perhaps AI is less energy intensive than people. So I think a reasonable estimate would be you have some trend stationarity, that you continue to see improvements in the energy efficiency of producing 100 widgets.
Right. Or just I would think about the energy productivity of the economy, right? The sort of BTUs per dollar might go down a lot, but we're going to have a lot more dollars. And the thing that I'm puzzled by is is that denominator going to grow faster than the numerator? Because then in a rapidly growing AI world, right? You look at estimates of additional growth from 0.5 point to 1.5 points. If that's today's energy intensity, our forecasts have to change a lot, I think, especially if that happens over a decade and a half or 2 decades. It'd be a remarkably different world. Last question, fusion power. How does an economist think about these promised technologies, which are near limitless, basically free? How should we think about it? If that stuff is really in the offing? We've got several firms here in the US who think they're going to reach ignition in the next few years. We'll see. But it seems like that could be as disruptive as the shale revolution, if not more. How do you think about those sort of disruptive technologies?
So to a certain extent, those things are fundamentally, disruptive technologies are fundamentally unforecastable.
Right.
Our view is that we are an engineering company with a comparative advantage in the transformation of molecules.
Right.
And that's why we have focused our investments in areas in which we can bring that expertise to bear.
Yeah.
So that includes in the low carbon solution space, it includes biofuels, it includes carbon capture and sequestration, it includes lithium and graphite, and it includes hydrogen, because those are areas where we think our engineering expertise, I'm an economist, in a firm full of engineers, but that's where we think we can bring our comparative advantage to bear.
Excellent. Well, I really am grateful that you came to talk to us about this. I know that this is an important exercise for the company, going back to 1945, and it's always a delight to hear how you and companies like yours are thinking about these broad global challenges and our common future. So thank you, Tyler, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Colleagues, please do check out this Outlook from 2025. It's available on Exxon's website. Tyler's an author of several books, which you might also be interested in checking out on economic history. I think there's another one in the forthcoming. And do join us next time. This is Joseph Majkut signing off for CSIS.